Rise to Reign podcast. This is season 2, episode 17. I am your host, Amy Killingsworth, and today's episode is a continuation of a mini-series on the mind. So I am going in sequential order here. So if you missed the last couple podcasts, you may want to go back and listen to them, but I'll give you a quick little recap so that we have context. So we are unpacking the Rise to Reign framework, which is 7 categories of living or 7 categories of healing that have 7 pillars of wisdom applied to them. So we have finished the 7 pillars of wisdom and we're into the 7 categories now. And the categories are the body, the soul, the spirit, relationships, finances, creativity, and calling. So we're in the soul right now, and I'm doing a mini series on each of the different components of the soul. The Hebrew concept of the soul is actually a complex of your mind, which is your mental space, your will, and your emotions. So that's what makes up the soul. And to recap, you are a spirit. The true part of you, the truest part of who you are, is a spirit, and that exists outside of time. It existed before time, and it will continue to exist in eternity after time. You have a soul, and that's your mind, will, and emotions, or your personality, and you live in a body. So that's what makes up the tripart being. And most healing approaches, especially like Western healing approaches focus on one of those things to the exclusion of another. So if you go into the doctor and you're like, I have a, pain in the neck, they're going to prescribe you a drug or give you a procedure for the pain in the neck. But really, most of the time when you have some kind of physical ailment, there is maybe even all of the time, there is an emotional component underlying that. And so to treat the physical body without addressing the emotional component or the subtle emotional body is to really not do anything at all, not to get to the root cause. You might be able to create some comfort, which is also known as numbing, and some distraction away from that symptom, but you have not addressed the root cause. So I would consider this area here of the soul to be what the entire process of healing really turns on, because this is the essence of a human being. When your soul leaves your body, it isn't animated anymore. When you have damage to your soul, you see that play out in a myriad of ways, and problems in relationships and in your job, and all sorts of issues that bleed into every other area of your life, including your physical health, like I just mentioned. So this area right here, the mind, the will, and the emotions, is a really, really strategic and really, really important conversation to have when we're talking about healing. It may even be like the conversation. So I did a podcast 2 podcasts ago on reigning in your body and talked about applying the different categories to the body. And that's kind of the body is sort of the low hanging fruit when it comes to healing. That's somewhere where we can start, like getting enough sleep and hydrating and supplementing and eating healthy food. That's sort of the low hanging fruit where we can send the signal of safety to the nervous system to begin the real healing that happens in this area right here, which is this subtle emotional body. And it is said, and it is true, that the quality of your emotions determines the quality of your life. Well, the quality of your thoughts is what determines the quality of your emotions. So if you keep peeling back the layers, you're going to eventually get to something besides where the symptom is showing up usually. So like I mentioned, if you address one part of the personality, like if you go to counselor, psychiatrist for some, if you're having intrusive thoughts, or if you have like mental illness situation going on, and you just address that without addressing the physical body, without addressing spiritual health, you're not going to have a root cause or functional approach to healing. I hope that makes sense. So we're talking about the soul. Again, it's the mind, will, and the emotions. There's also, that goes along with this, a concept of the heart. And this is a biblical, like Hebrew concept, Old Testament complex concept of the heart. And that is the entire human personality, mind, will, emotions, the core of one's being, where there is no pretense. So your heart is a component of your soul, not a separate component, but it's maybe a way of describing your soul before your soul was corrupted by outside influences. Okay, so every single one of us that lives here in the 3D matrix and that is earthbound has a soul that has been, to one degree or another, corrupted. And I handled original sin in the last episode, which I promise you it's probably a different spin than you've maybe heard of it taught in religious scenarios or religious circumstances. But basically, when we heal the mind specifically, we are correcting the way that we think. Not even necessarily what we think, although what we think is corrected when we correct the way that we think. When we heal the mind, when we heal the systems of thought, we are correcting lies that we have believed about God, about ourself, and about the nature of the universe, or how the world works, or what is even the nature of reality. So when we heal the mind, we're correcting the lies that we've believed about God, ourselves, who we are, and really others, our surroundings, or the nature of the universe, or the nature of reality. And that could also be called an awakening. So this is where you begin to get outside. When you heal your mind, you begin to get outside of the narrative or the story that your trauma and your conditioning has been playing for you over and over and over throughout your life. Now, some of that was passed down to you through generations, and it's ancestral. And it's something that you picked up through your DNA, and then it's reinforced in the family that you grew up in. But nobody gets out of this world without some level of trauma and without some level of accepting something about ourselves, about our identity, that isn't true. And so this all happens in the thought world. So what you think about yourself, what you think about God, what you think about the world, the universe, the nature of reality, will determine your lived experience. So this is really, 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 really important. There's a scripture in Proverbs that says, as a man thinks in his heart, or as a woman, or as a person thinks in their heart, so are they. So as you think, that's going to create your life. Thoughts precipitate emotions, emotions precipitate words, and words create worlds. So we have to correct the way that we think. Yes, we have to correct what we think, but we have to correct the way that we think, and that will automatically correct what we think. I hope that makes sense. So in this episode, what I'm going to do is handle the 7 pillars of wisdom as applied to your mental structures. And so I want to touch back. Last episode, I really unpacked the idea of patterns of thinking, or mental strongholds. And so I want to touch back on that concept and talk about how our thought systems are sort of like these like jumbled, tangled like balls of yarn. And we have to unwind those with introspection. And the Bible tells us a process that is taking every thought captive, which is unwinding and really examining with self-awareness what we're thinking and holding it up to see if it's true. Because the process of healing the mind is really overcoming the lies that we've believed and replacing them with truth. A.W. Tozer said that what you think about God is the most important thing about you. Because we talked about this in the last episode. If you believe that God's a tyrant, or if you believe that God doesn't exist, or you believe that God doesn't care, or that he's punishing you, or that he's holding out on you, if those are thoughts, beliefs are systems of thoughts or strongholds. And so if you believe that way, that's how you're going to run your life. And that's what creates a lot of problems and what gets us outside of original design. So when we think about God, my premise and what I believe is the truth, what is the true premise is that God created us very, very, very intentionally. And he designed us specifically. And then he told us how to run ourselves. And that's our original design. And so there's like this overlay of lies that we've believed. And when we begin to peel back those layers of lies and start to really uncover and embrace our true self, that's when we discover who we really are and who we were made to be and what we are here to do in the earth. So it's really, 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 really critical what we think, but more importantly, how we think. Okay, so with that level of background, what I want to do now is take the 7 pillars of wisdom and apply them to the mental space. So the first pillar of wisdom is identity. So the definition of identity is the condition of being a certain person, like I'm Amy Killingsworth, that's my identity, a set of characteristics by which a person is known. So this could be that they are kind, they are loving, they have brown hair, they are a podcaster. So characteristics by which a person is known. How you see yourself and how others see you and who you really are. And so to help us sort of parse out and really have a hook to hang this concept of identity on, I use the 4 archetypes of the prisoner, the slave, the princess, and then the royal, which is either the king or the queen. And so the king or the queen is your true identity. That is what is beneath all of the layers, is the king or queen. So when we're talking about mental identity, we really want to focus on, like, how does a king or a queen think? Okay, so I want to sort of add a little anecdote here, and I've mentioned it before, but I have 3 children. Most of you know that. And one of my outcomes for parenting, I just have a little handful of outcomes that helps me sort of decide what's important when I am parenting my children, and what kind of children, what kind of humans I want to release into the world. Like what is my vision for my children when I'm parenting them? And that helps inform the decisions that I make and what I consider important and how I structure my parenting choices. And so one of my main outcomes for my children is that they would be critical thinkers, that they would know how to think. Thinking is a skill. So you have a mind that is just going to be a completely wild animal if you haven't disciplined it. So if you're like me and you're in your 40s and you've never intentionally disciplined your mind to examine your thoughts and become self-aware, then you're going to be out of mental shape. And it takes some effort, it takes some training, it takes some intentionality to get your mind into discipline and deciding what you're going to think. And so that is the process of taking every thought captive, is examining, it's really thinking about what you're thinking about. So this is where the king or the queen actually kind of steps back and observes the thought process. And so it's really useful to have these archetypes when you're thinking about what you're thinking about. So the prisoner is, of course, the consummate victim, and always in victim energy and characterized by blame. So when you notice yourself going into blame and thinking blame thoughts and thinking victim thoughts, the king or the queen can identify that by sort of like stepping outside of the story or the narrative, like they hurt me, they suck, they're a jerk, and stepping outside of that and then choosing to think about that situation like a queen or like a king. So we have the ability to do that. That's called consciousness, and that is endowed in us by our creator. When we're in the prisoner, the slave, or the princess, though, we are unconscious. And so it's kind of like we're asleep. So the princess, or sorry, the queen or the king is the one that's like it's like the adult in the situation, right? Like it's the one that's going to go like, nope, I'm not doing that. I'm choosing differently. And sometimes it can be very hard, especially when you're not practiced at it. So think about like if you want to get in shape or you want to run a half marathon and you have just been sitting on your couch eating ice cream for your whole life, it's going to take some training. And the first time you get out there, you're going to be huffing and you're going to be puffing and it's not going to be easy, but when you stick with it, you eventually get into better and better and better shape, and running for you becomes easy and maybe even enjoyable. It's the same way with mental discipline. And so with your mental identity, you have to decide what is your outcome? Like, who do you want to be in the world? And then you have to arrange your thoughts around that identity. So the slave is the martyr. This is like the codependent person, controlling, manipulative. That's the martyr. And then the princess or the prince is the sort of the empowered version of the lower self, where it's like we're not going to take it, I'm not going to take it anymore, like I'm going to rage against the machine, I'm going to stand up to this. This is where we see like feminisms would be in the category of like the princess of like you know you had your chance, I'm taking over now, I'm rising up, girl power, girl boss kind of stuff. And the queen or the king, just depending on gender, is truly, truly, truly at peace with who he or she is and doesn't have anything to prove. So, based on the archetypes, and I handle this in detail in the identity episode way back at the beginning of the season. You can go back and listen to that if you haven't. But you decide you're going to be the queen, that's who you are really, but you decide that you're going to show up in the world. Remember, identity is how others see you. A big component of your identity is how do others see you? Well, others see you through the lens of their patterning, and that's not always correct. But others' experience of you has a good amount to do with how you show up, with how you behave, with how you speak, with whether or not you can be trusted with what your character is. So where mental identity is, it's a basic function of making the decision to understand how a queen or king would think, and then paying attention to what you're thinking about and examining those thoughts and choosing to intentionally line them up with with your chosen identity, which is of a queen. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so the next key or the next principle of the Rise to Reign process or framework is sovereignty. So sovereignty is supreme authority or rule. It's also self-governance. And sovereignty is encapsulated by this quote: you can give your authority away, but you can't give your responsibility away. So a good example of this is if you get into a car with somebody who has been drinking, you're giving your authority to that person to drive you, and they're impaired. Or really, they don't have to have been drinking. If you get into somebody's car, you're really giving your authority to move your body through space and time in a car to another person. But if they wreck the car and you're injured, that's now your responsibility. You're going to have to go to the hospital. You're going to have to get a surgery. You're going to have to maybe like go through rehab or whatever. So you can give your authority away, but you cannot give your responsibility away. I'm sorry, I can't leave it alone. Right now, what we see in like the medical field and the medical intervention is a whole bunch of people who've given their power or their sovereignty or their authority away to a system or to a doctor or to a professional or to a mandate. So the fact that the process of giving your power or your authority away, that's yours to do. It's yours. You can give it away, but you can't give your responsibility away. So if you take a drug or if you get a procedure and there's a side effect, you may be able to blame somebody else, but you are still going to have the responsibility of dealing with that thing. I hope that makes sense. So what is mental sovereignty? I really, 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 really want you to catch this. Mental sovereignty is choosing your story, your thoughts, your reality. And there is a million categories and bytes of information coming at you all the time from social media, from the news, from people around you that are constantly trying to suck you into their narrative. And so it's really, really, really important that you choose intentionally and consciously what you are going to think about so that you can have the emotional health and strength and atmosphere that you want to have, because remember, your thoughts are going to create your emotions are going to create the quality of your life and seriously affect your finances and your relationships and everything else. So mental sovereignty is basically the process of deciding what you're going to think. It's critical thinking. It's critical thinking. It's not just accepting a piece of information because it's part of a narrative. What do I mean when I say a narrative? Well, there's all sorts of agendas that want to create your reality and tell you how things are, the nature of reality. And most of those are controlling and manipulative and have nefarious agendas, meaning that they aren't in your best interest. They're in the best interest of the person that is like spinning, or the organization or the group of people or the government or whatever, or the company that is spinning that narrative. And so what is super, super important is that we all make a commitment to mental sovereignty, meaning that we critically examine every piece of information before we accept it. Because we have a lot of people who are just conditioned to accept a narrative, a story, because that's all they've ever heard, or that's what their parents believed, or whatever. And so what's needed really, really, really desperately in the world right now is mental sovereignty, which is the process of critical thinking. Okay, so that's mental identity and mental sovereignty. The next category is mental amnesty. And amnesty, as you've probably heard me explain before, is just a robust concept of forgiveness. And not only did I need to make it an alliteration and have the TY at the end of it, but I like the idea of amnesty because when we're talking about the sovereign, when we're talking about their king or the queen, they have the political authority to let people off the hook. That's what amnesty is, really, is like to grant a pardon, so to speak, like a political pardon. And so when we let people off the hook or let situations off the hook, we grant them amnesty. So again, this was handled, all of these were handled separately in separate podcasts closer to the beginning of the season if you want to go back and touch on these. So amnesty is to grant a pardon to, like grant a general no exclusions pardon to. It's a forgetting or overlooking of an offense or class of offenses, and it's a robust concept of forgiveness. So, amnesty or forgiveness is how we heal our thought system. So, I don't have a lot of time to spend on this, but I just want to kind of walk you through a process of what this looks like. Usually, when we start inquiring or observing or starting the process of mental inquiry and start observing our thoughts, we can very easily get into like a shame spiral. So what this looks like is like I'm going to think loving thoughts about people, and then you have a really unloving thought. If somebody does something, you have a really unloving thought about somebody. And then instead of just dealing with the unloving thought, now you have a shame spiral and a recrimination and a accusation that's now coming against you. And see, look at how unloving you are, and you can't do this, and you don't even follow your own rules, and like that shame spiral that happens when we do something that we didn't intend to do, or that maybe is not in line with our chosen character, the way that we want to show up in the world. So this is where forgiveness, mental forgiveness of our thoughts becomes really, really important. And this is actually how we heal the thought system. So when you have a thought that's fearful, or when you have a thought that's unloving, that just intrudes, it just pops up, the process is to notice it and then to just forgive it, which forgive it is just to let it go and just to not dwell on it and just to not hang out there. The other thing too, and I'll get into this more when I talk about actual spirit and spiritual things, but those thoughts often aren't even yours. When you have a horrible thought about somebody, usually that's been injected into you by an entity outside of you. And so if you take it and you love it and nurture it and accept it as your own, it becomes yours because you attach your will to it. You gave your sovereignty to it, and now it is your thought. And that's how strongholds are formed. But the skill is to notice the thought and then forgive it, which means just letting it go instead of dwelling on it, instead of dealing with it, instead of nurturing it, instead of agreeing with it. You have a thought come in and you just let it go. You have a thought come in and you just let it go. There's a scripture in Philippians, I referenced it in the last podcast, chapter 4, where the Apostle Paul or St. Paul tells us to think about things that are good, that are true, that are noble, that make us feel good. Think about things that make you feel good. You get to choose what you think about, so why not think about things that make you feel good? I mean, this is something that people will argue me to the ground on, which amuses me in a sort of perverse way, because it's like, why wouldn't you think about things that make you feel good? Is because when you feel good, you attract good to your life and you show up well and happy and joyful for the people around you. And how can that possibly be a bad thing? But for some reason, there's resistance to that. But I just invite you to drop your resistance and try this. When you have thoughts that are unpleasant, maybe ruminating thoughts about what somebody did to you, or something that happened to you, or the state of the world, or the opposing political party, or whatever, my invitation to you is just to let that go. Just to let go of it and not grab a hold of it and start ruminating and rotating around and around and around it. That's what mental amnesty is. Okay, so mental integrity is the next pillar. Integrity is the quality or condition of being whole or undivided. It's a concept of being complete. For rise to reign purposes, we say that integrity is the outside matching the inside, or telling the truth without manipulation. So where mental integrity is concerned, this has to do with really being honest with yourself about the state of maybe your mental health, or your thought cycles, or your systems of thought. So integrity is really just like looking at your thoughts and saying, wow, I have patterns of negative thinking, or I have patterns of vengeful thinking, or I have patterns of lustful thinking. or I have patterns of prideful thinking. So mental integrity is really just the process of observing and being honest with yourself and maybe a trusted other about what is true. Because when we talk about, especially like in the coaching world, when we talk about creating change, there's 2 points of data that we need before we can create any change. The first point is, where do you want to go? Like we want mental health. We want to have our thoughts taken captive to to obedience of Christ, which just means following Christ's example of unconditional love. And that's where we're headed. We want to have good thoughts, true thoughts, pure thoughts, loving thoughts. So we have to get that data point. That's where we want to go. The other data point that we need, though, equally as important, is where are we at right now? And so this is like the searching and fearless inventory of what's going on inside of you and inside of your thought system, so that you can accurately get that representation, so that you know how to close the gap and you can pay attention, what your patterns are, and you come conscious in your patterns. I shared in the vulnerability episode that I have a pattern of blame thoughts where abandonment is concerned, and feeling like people are letting me down, or believing that people are letting me down, which creates feelings of being abandoned. So what integrity is again to come conscious and be the observer, to pull back and look at the thoughts that you're thinking of and let go of the ones that you don't want, and to continue with the ones that you do want. Okay, so the next the next principle in the Rise to Reign framework is polarity. So this is the possession or manifestation of two opposing attributes, tendencies, or principles. And in the Rise to Reign framework, it's the case of gender polarity, which is masculine and feminine. So for this, I'm not going to handle it super a lot, because you would have to go back and listen to the polarity episodes, which I covered them in detail. But where it comes to your thoughts, when it comes to your mental state, how does a man think? How does a woman think? It's important to know that. How does a male think? How does a female think? And this is a process, again, of self-observation and self-inquiry. And if you're a female wanting to come back into wanting to more embrace the feminine, then what is that? What does that look like? What is feminine qualities? What are feminine thoughts? And then intentionally choosing that. Okay, so the next one is vulnerability. And this is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. It's the unstable feeling we get when we step out of our comfort zone or do something that forces us to loosen control. So vulnerability is honestly more of an emotional construct. So I'll get to that more when we talk about emotions. But this whole process that we're talking about of self-inquiry requires a high degree of vulnerability, because you have to be willing to admit that you aren't where you want to be in your mind. You're not where you want to be in your thoughts, and that you want to see change, and that you want to create a different reality. And that requires vulnerability, just even to start that process. Okay, so the last one is generosity. And so what does mental generosity look like? Well, generosity is the quality of giving unselfishly to others, money, material objects, time, generosity of spirit. So if you've decided that you're going to be generous or vulnerable or feminine, you can apply this to the last 3 of the principles. What are generous thoughts versus what are maybe selfish thoughts? And so it all starts in the thought life. If you have determined to be generous or to embrace vulnerability or femininity or masculinity, then your thoughts need to be centered around generosity. So when you have decided that you're going to be generous and you notice a thought go through your mind that's like a me mind thought, that's one of those thoughts that you would want to let go of and release. And you would maybe want to embrace a thought that is one that is giving unselfishly of yourself to others. All right, my friends, that is our time that we have to deal with this. In the next episode, we are going to move on from, we're going to stay in the soul, but we're going to move on from the mind into the emotions. And I'm super excited about this category because I feel like it's really where the most transformation takes place. And it's really just where I feel like my zone of genius is, and where I see the most change and healing and deliverance really happen in people's lives. So I'm super excited about next week. Thank you so much for being with me today, and I'll see you next week in the next episode.